present our closing keynote, How Rare Disease Communities Lead the Revolution. Welcome, Susannah.
Thank you so much for having me. I have to say, it's not an exaggeration that the rare disease community has inspired the last 15 years of my career. I totally changed the trajectory of what I wanted to accomplish in life, thanks to field work that I did with the National Organization of Rare Disorders back in 2010. And I just am honored to be here. And I'm honored to have spent this past 3 days with all of you, because it really makes sense that you guys are the front lines of the patient-led revolution. And I see the clicker, and it's coming toward me. Thank you. Thank you. So what I want to begin with, though, is a look at the past, because I think by acknowledging where we've come from, we can start to see where we're going with even more clarity. You might have seen this cover story in the Atlantic Monthly, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it. Adele Halpern was born with Coffin-Siris syndrome 12 in 1951. Her parents were told that there was nothing that anyone could do, and they should send her to Willowbrook State School, which they did when Adele was not yet 2 years old. Her family will never know the details of what happened, but we can tell that it's a searing parable of loss. All of her teeth were pulled, but there's no record as to why. She was given no opportunity to develop her intellect, and she did not live in a loving home until the end of her life. Her niece, Jennifer Sr., reconnected with her aunt near the end of her life, and she told her story in the Atlantic. The reason I share it is the difference that 50 years can make. What Jennifer Sr. did was go and find one of the other 200 people in the world who has the same rare genetic condition, Coffin-Siris syndrome 12. It's a little girl named Emma, who actually lives in Kansas City. And she's thriving, thanks to parents who have access to the data and tools and information that they need to help her thrive. So obviously, what's the difference? The difference is connection. The difference is that her parents had access to what they needed, and Adele's parents did not. 30 years before Adele was born, in 1922, another child was born with visible disabilities. He was born with partial hearing loss and full facial paralysis, which meant that he could not latch on, he couldn't suck to get milk. And again, his parents were told, you should put him in an institution and forget about him. This was their firstborn child. But his mother was a woman of indomitable spirit, and I always get emotional when I tell the story, because imagine it's 1922 and you have a child with full facial paralysis, but she took him home and raised him alongside his younger siblings. And when it came time to send him to school, she forced the school system to take him. Again, we're talking about the 1920s and 30s. And he thrived. He was able to go to college, and he had a long career in the family laundry and dry cleaning business in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was many years before they even had a diagnosis. And some of you in the room might know that Jenny Whitman is here. She's the executive director of the Mobius Syndrome Foundation. Now, Mobius syndrome is a very rare condition. It's about 1 in 300,000 people, maybe even 1 in a million. It has no known cause or cure. It's a genetic condition that affects the 6th and 7th cranial nerves, which again causes full facial paralysis, which affects your ability to blink, to suck, to smile, to move your eyes from side to side. And I happened one day to sit next to Burt Minow's niece, Nell Minow, and she told me his story. She said that she was a very early internet user, and she used to test search engines. Back when we didn't all use Google, when we were using multiple different search engines, Nell would test these search engines in the 1990s by typing in obscure terms. And so one day, she typed in the term Mobius syndrome, and she got a hit. And it was a website that was put up by a family of a young child with Mobius. And through the web, again, this is the 1990s, they had connected with other families all around the world with kids with Mobius. So Nell wrote to them, telling them about her Uncle Bert. And they wrote back immediately and asked how old he was. And Nell said, he's in his 70s. Well, the medical literature at the time was very limited. There was no record of anyone living past their 30s in the medical literature. And so that day, hundreds of families all around the world found out that their children could live a typical lifespan. And Burt Minow found out that for the last year of his life, he was the elder statesman of a very small but very excited community. And I love telling this story because to all of you in the room, this is the story of your lives too. This is the moment when you get a diagnosis and you feel completely alone, and then you make a connection. And whether or not you have a diagnosis, you at least can be part of the broader rare disease community. And you can come to a conference like this and meet other people that are not so rare. And it reminds me actually of something that somebody else with Mobius has said. Natalie Abbott, who lives with Mobius syndrome, said that rare isn't so rare when there are 100 of you. And she was describing an in-person Mobius syndrome conference, which happens about every 2 years. And Natalie went on to say, instead of hope for a cure, for me and others with incurable conditions, hope is the state of mind fostered by a strong community who knows and accepts the fact that not all things in life can be cured. Hope comes through connections, resources, strength, and time instead of in a pill. But hope is as valuable as a cure. That's what we all created and experienced this week, this sense of hope through connection. So how do we keep the momentum going? How do we keep this revolution moving forward? And I'm so thankful to be the closing keynote and be charged with trying to figure out how to keep the momentum going. I'm a researcher who has worked at the intersection of healthcare and technology for the past 2 decades. I got advice very early on from my mentor, Tom Ferguson, who said, if you want to understand where technology and healthcare are going, you actually need to spend time with the most radical pioneers, the cowboys and hackers of healthcare. You need to spend time with people living with rare disease. You need to spend time with people living with life-changing diagnoses. And I took his advice and I started spending time in these communities. And as I say, it really changed my life. What I realized, though, is that there are so many people who have not had the privilege of spending time in our communities, and therefore they don't know how amazing it is to see the future here on stage. With just this last panel and all the panels that we saw, we're seeing the future because they understand that data interoperability, that's the future. That's the future for all of us, whether you have something real, common or rare. The very first report that I wrote for the Pew Research Center, which was a long time ago, it was in the year 2000, my co-author and I called it the online healthcare revolution. And now, more than 20 years later, I'm about to publish a book called Rebel Health. And it's a field guide to the patient-led revolution. So I want to talk for a minute about this word revolution. Why do we call this a revolution? Well, what else do you call a grassroots uprising by people who all of a sudden get access to the information, data, and tools that they need to cause change? What do we call it when people are all of a sudden able to communicate with each other? The American Revolution was built on pamphlets. The printing press allowed people to spread over great distances this vision for a new nation. And that's what the internet is doing for us now. We have a vision for what healthcare could be and what it could look like, and it's because of the internet. But I want to say there's more to it than just access to data and information. It's really about access to each other. We are learning from each other about how to collect data, how to conduct personal science, and how to build medical and assistive devices. I think one of the panels that really was inspiring to me, there were so many panels about the importance of data, and coming in from sort of the outside, it might seem obvious to everyone in this room that data should be owned by the patient. That's the new default, as Dr. Demarest of Children's Hospital of Colorado said. That's the new default because of all of you and because of all of the people who fought for that in years past. That really is a sea change in healthcare, that patients, number one, should have access to their data and stewardship of their data. And also, the amazing thing that I see in the landscape is that once people are connected peer-to-peer, they're able to start taking action. They can take an individual action inspired by what they see, or they can take collective action. And it might be one small act every day, but it also might be, and I love this phrase, the big, hairy, audacious goal that Charlene Sun-Rigby talked about, the BHAG. And I just want to say, it's pretty much of a career accomplishment to teach somebody from the federal government a new acronym. It was really impressive, so thank you. But let's talk for a minute about revolutions. I found this quote, which I love, by Polish war correspondent Ryszard Kapuczynski. And he wrote, "All books about revolutions begin with a chapter that describes the decay of tottering authority or the misery and sufferings of the people. They should begin with a psychological chapter, one that shows how a harassed and terrified man suddenly breaks his terror, stops being afraid. Man gets rid of fear and feels free. Without that, there would be no revolution." Well, I'm here today to thank the most daring revolutionaries. The rare disease community is all about people who got rid of their fear, who felt free to ask for access to their data, to start asking policymakers and scientists and clinicians and each other to reach higher, to be able to accomplish what you're after. Your data and your insights are shaping the future of discovery. Really, we are all standing on foundations that were dug by hand by some of the people in this room and some of the forebears in the rare disease communities. So in writing my book, I realized that what I really wanted to do was bring this gospel, bring this idea of what patients and caregivers and survivors can bring to healthcare. I wanted to make it easier for people to understand. So I created 4 archetypes of the patient-led revolution. These are the people that you'll meet when you join the revolution. And by the way, I think everyone in here probably is all for archetypes, but I'll go on and describe them, and you can think about what most resonates with you. I wrote this book for two reasons. There were two audiences that I was thinking of. One is, frankly, everyone. Everyone who is going to have any interaction with the healthcare system. I want people to step into their power. I want people to see that they have a unique role to play in the future of healthcare and health innovation. The second reason I wrote it is to help people who are in the C-suite of healthcare, people who are in the boardrooms, people who sit in the highest levels of government, who have not, again, had the privilege to spend time with patients and survivors and caregivers. I want them to see the diversity of the talent and skill sets that we all bring, that it's actually a competitive advantage to partner with patients. So the first archetype are seekers. Now, again, with a rare disease audience, I think this is going to describe everyone in the room. Seekers are people who, at first, are not getting the answers that they need. They sense that something's not right, and they decide to take action. Often they have a diagnosis that's dropped them into a maze, and there's no maps and seemingly no way out. So they start to call out to each other, is there anyone else in here? Or there are people who haven't got a diagnosis, and nobody has any answers. Seekers set to work, they're often hopeful, but in my interviews, what I also noticed is that seekers are also often angry and frustrated. Seekers go out on the hunt. Now, if this describes you, if you identify as a seeker, I thought about some actions that you can take coming out of this conference. And some people have already talked about this. Look for a family in your community or has similar symptoms to you or your loved one. And maybe they're honestly just too exhausted or stunned to have gotten started. If you are a skilled seeker, find them, interview them, find out what are their questions, and you go out on the hunt for them. What's really important, I've done this kind of work, it's just as important to find out what people are not ready to hear. There are some people who say, I want to find out about prognosis. I don't want to look at any surgery videos. Other people say, I want everything. Bring me all of it. Think about what a service this could be for a family who is just behind you on the same path. The second archetype are networkers. Again, people who are searching for a diagnosis or newly diagnosed, long to hear the words, "You are not alone." You know, you think about Burt Minow living into his 70s, having never met anyone else with Mobius syndrome. You think about those families who finally connect with each other through the web, and they start to exchange information. That's, again, what all of us here have experienced in our own lives. Connection is an antidote to suffering. And when people are able to tap into peer-to-peer networks of patients and caregivers, networkers learn in community. What's really interesting is that when I talk about these archetypes with my friends in the corporate world or in government, they say, oh, I know exactly what you mean. You're talking about Facebook. And I say, yes, and. Or people say, oh, I know exactly what you mean. You're talking about something like Alcoholics Anonymous. Yes, and. Networkers, thanks to the internet, are able to pool resources and urge each other to stand up for themselves. And again, that's what we've seen here. If you identify as a networker, become a better fact checker. Do not share anything if you haven't done the research yourself, if you haven't read the article. Become one of those people that clicks on the footnotes and follows the links so that you can be sure you're sharing the best for your community. Networkers pool resources. Let's make sure it's a safe pool to dip into for information. The third archetype are solvers. And frankly, we just had a panel that was for solvers up there, people who identify a challenge, test and develop new concepts. They write code, they create inventions, they come up with new systems, all towards meeting their needs. What I have found is that solvers work with really intense urgency because their lives or the life of a loved one depends on them meeting a challenge. I like to say they creatively get access to what they need. They are bending or breaking rules in pursuit of a goal. And a lot of speakers have talked about this over the past few days. Especially people with rare disease are making a way out of no way. In my interviews, what I found is that some solvers openly share their innovation. They can't wait to post a prototype online, to share the code on GitHub, to do whatever it takes to get feedback about what they're working on. But actually just as important are the solvers who are quieter. They might not want to share because they're just not natural networkers. They also might be working within regulatory or corporate structures. And so there's a lot of different solvers that we can look for and be respectful of. But the bottom line is solvers attack problems. Since I am speaking to a rare disease community, I'm actually going to cross-pollinate and tell a story from a different community, because that's a lot of what I really like to do. I like to bring stories from different communities. This is a story about a condition that affects about 34 million Americans, type 1 diabetes or insulin-requiring diabetes. If you have anybody in your life or you yourself live with type 1 diabetes, you know that it requires constant vigilance. And some people are helped in this vigilance with medical devices, a continuous glucose monitor or CGM, and insulin pumps. Now, these are miracles. These are amazing devices. But the medical device companies that created them, some of which I realize are based here in San Diego, they built them with the data locked down. You absolutely can't get access to your own data or your child's data. You actually have to be in the same room to look at a screen to see the data output of where the child's blood sugar is going. Well, this is pretty annoying. So the Diabetes Rebel Alliance, and they have a great hashtag and motto, which is "We are not waiting." They had an engineer in their ranks, John Kostick, and he figured out how to hack into his son's continuous glucose monitor, free the data, and send it to his Apple Watch. And so he just posted it on Twitter. He just posted how he did it. And so all of a sudden, all over the world, people who have those skill sets were hacking into their continuous glucose monitor or their child's and following the protocol and sending the data to their Apple Watch, which, by the way, meant that they could let a kid go on a school field trip without them. Imagine. They could let their kid go on a sleepover. They could just check their watch. A lot of parents, especially when a kid is really having trouble maintaining a certain blood sugar level, the parents set alarms throughout the night, every 4 hours, to physically get up and go in and look at the kid's blood sugar. So it's like having a newborn for like 16 years. And instead, they can at least stay in bed and look at their Apple Watch and see the reading. So this was a revolutionary concept for the Diabetes Rebel Alliance. What I love about it is that that was the solver group. Then the networkers came in and they said, well, everybody needs to know about this. And so they started the Night Scout Foundation, which their most dominant platform is Facebook. And because the Night Scout Foundation teaches anybody around the world who wants to learn how to do this. Here's what's really key. And again, this is probably familiar to anyone here who has kind of freelanced their child's treatments or treatments for themselves. One of my favorite quotes from someone who was actually a rare disease dad who was asked, like, oh, does the FDA let you do that? And he said, in my house, I am the FDA. Because the key with the Diabetes Rebel Alliance is they don't sell the code. They don't sell a handbook about how to do this. It's given away for free. And therefore, the FDA, after a little bit of hesitation, is actually fine with it because it's pushing the industry towards where the FDA wants the industry to go. Because all of us who've had the privilege of interacting directly with people at the FDA, they really do want progress. They want to see progress in data interoperability and access to data and people just doing what they need to do to live. So if you identify as a solver, write a manifesto. I loved what you guys were talking about in terms of just create the specifications of the tool that you think should exist. Write the specifications of the network that you need to exist so that when somebody comes along who can help you with that, you are ready. I loved what Mark Dant said yesterday when he talked about how the FDA's mission is to make sure that we have safe and effective treatments. And what patients, survivors, and caregivers add is urgency. And there's nothing like urgency, just like we talked about in the last panel, this idea of creating this cadence where there's an expectation of progress. For so many years in diabetes, the attitude, frankly, was, we gave you insulin. We gave you continuous glucose monitors. Why are you complaining? And the patient said, that's not good enough. We want more. So another action that you can take is also to build your personal science skills. I bet a lot of you already do tracking, whether it's for your child or for yourself. Think about what are the low-tech tools of personal science that you can use, but also what are the high-tech tools. And if you are a networker, you can publicize, what are the tools of personal science that are really, really useful for yourself or for your loved one. And I just want to say, I really hope that the caregivers in the audience are doing personal science tracking for themselves, making sure that you are getting some sleep, making sure that you're getting some exercise, because you need to take care of yourself, just as it's important to take care of your loved one. The fourth group are champions. Champions take scrappy new ideas to scale. They give seekers and networkers and solvers access to resources held by mainstream healthcare institutions, such as funding, media attention, regulatory guidance, access to labs, access to manufacturing facilities. When I was interviewing people in medical and assistive device innovation, it's not only access to data, but literally access to the materials that they need to experiment with some of these medical and assistive devices. A champion could be a journalist like Amy Doxer-Marcus, who dives down deep into a certain condition and garners national and international attention for a group of seeker, networker, solvers who are saving lives and are an example for everyone. Another example of a champion is someone who's an ambassador, who can speak to the rebels and to the suits, who can go before the FDA or talk to the NIH and speak with that scientific authority. Sometimes it is, a total civilian who can do that. We all know somebody in the room, or maybe it's you, who's got essentially a PhD in the rare disease that you've got. It's been incredibly impressive to see people just have incredible medical terms just roll off your tongue like it's nothing. We also saw that on the panels yesterday, Patty Engel of Engage Health was someone who is that ambassador who can speak to the rebels in the suits. Kevin Friard of Salem Oaks also fits that description. People who are able to, if they're not a champion themselves, they can introduce people to champions. So if you identify as a champion, look for ways to unlock sources of power within your institution. For example, if you spot a rebel health team who's executed a successful pilot or launched a new product or service in a small market, you can recruit them to your incubator or your startup accelerator. We really need to see more of that. We need to see more structure to help entrepreneurs scale. Innovators always are able to make faster progress if there is a structure, a vessel for them to pour their idea into. A champion can help solvers wrap a business idea around an idea and a business imperative around an idea and help it succeed. So again, I created these 4 archetypes to help people identify who they are and the role that they either want to play or already play in the health innovation ecosystem. I really want people who are not yet part of the revolution to see the value that you all bring to the conversation. We have so much to offer people who have access to power and have access to funding, whether they're scientists or medical device company executives or pharmaceutical executives or policymakers. And what I'm hoping is that people can use these archetypes to say, you need me, I'm a seeker solver. Or actually, I see what you're trying to do with this innovation that you have, and actually, I'm a networker and I can help make sure that everybody knows about it. So one of the other challenges when I moved from being a researcher to spending more time in the C-suite of healthcare, I had trouble helping my colleagues, for example, at the US Department of Health and Human Services to understand what I was talking about when I was talking about the challenge of rare disease. And so I created a visualization. It's very simple. My goal was to create something that anybody could sketch on a napkin. It starts with a horizontal line. And you can see that at one side, the people's needs are not being met by mainstream healthcare. And on the other side, people's needs are being met. What's really important to understanding this model is that we don't decide whose needs are being met. It's actually up to the people themselves, because sometimes there is a remedy that works for most people, but not for a certain individual, and their needs are not being met. In the diabetes example, a lot of people thought that people with insulin-requiring diabetes, if we give them insulin, then their needs are being met. Not true. And so what I then decided to do was add the visibility axis. And this it expresses this idea of who is visible to mainstream healthcare. Are there people who, for example, control access to really valuable resources in the current healthcare system who both recognize the problem and see it as their job to help? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great if we all were at the top of that visibility axis? But the truth is there's a lot of people down at the bottom who are not visible. And by the way, when I talk about mainstream healthcare, there are a lot of people who can unlock sources of power. It can be clinicians, it can be health insurance companies, payers, policymakers, regulators, journalists, investors, researchers, and patients and caregivers themselves. Unlocking and sharing resources can be uncomfortable. But as Esther Lucero said during the Equity Forum earlier this week, equity is about two things: transfer of resources and transfer of power. If it doesn't feel uncomfortable, you are not doing equity work. And I think about that. I think about how uncomfortable this can make people. And yet, this has to be our future. We have to make sure that rare diseases aren't always stuck on the invisible side of this spectrum. And they really aren't, because of the networkers in their ranks, because of organizations like Global Genes, who are able to get attention for things that are very, very rare. We need to help people pop up to the top of this matrix. And we need to draw the attention of champions who can help. In the worst case scenarios, people are unseen and ignored completely, even by friends and family. I call this the rebel health matrix, because what I want people to see is, if they don't yet see that there's a revolution going on, I want them to know that the patients, survivors, and caregivers are coming for them in a loving, joyful way. So I'm personally most concerned with the people in that lower left quadrant, and I'm sure all of you feel the same way. What the patient-led revolution aims to do is help people move up and to the right. Seekers are the people who go out hunting and find tools and ideas, and sometimes they just find courage to help them claw their way over to the right side, where their needs are being met, but they're still invisible. Global Genes is an example of a networker champion organization to try and pull people up into the top half, and hopefully to the top right, where people are visible and their needs are starting to get met. I wanted to give an illustration of how health rebels can band together to move from the needs not met invisible zone to a place where their needs are met. And again, I'm going to talk about the Diabetes Rebel Alliance. Amy Tenderick, who lives with type 1 diabetes, was really dissatisfied with the diabetes technology that was available to her. She is a journalist and a blogger, and I do that because, like, back in the day, who was a blogger? What she decided to do was start holding annual meetings where she would gather people together, anyone who touched on the idea of diabetes and technology and innovation. And she gathered together all of the seekers, networkers, solvers, and champions who wanted to create change. Something really important that she did is that when she, for example, would hear a corporate leader complain about someone in the government, the next year she would make sure that that person in the government would be there. And so she slowly built this incredible coalition of people who were all tracking towards the same goal. In the diabetes innovation story, seekers went out on the hunt for better ways to live with this life-limiting disease. Solvers came up with innovations that reached hundreds or maybe thousands of people. And that's where I'm talking about John Kostick and the CGM data and Night Scout Foundation. And that moved the issue over to the lower right quadrant, where some people's needs were being met. If you were lucky enough to hear about this and connect with it, then you probably were able to hack into a CGM and get access to the data. But it was really only for people in the know. And again, how much does that resonate with us? How lucky are all of us in the room that we were able to be here this week? And I just want to thank Global Genes for creating the live stream, for all the people who are not able to be here this week, that they can learn along with us. So thank you so much for providing that. What I love about the Diabetes Rebel Alliance is that, it wasn't good enough that they had access to the data. There were people in that group who were coming to Amy's annual meeting, and they said, okay, now that we have access to the CGM data, there's somebody else. Ben West has actually broken down his insulin pump on his living room floor. He took it apart and put it back together. And so why don't we loop those two devices? And so using a Raspberry Pi and medical grade algorithms that have been tested and are safe, they actually created a do-it-yourself, open source, artificial pancreas, where they had hacked into their own devices and created a solution. So again, the We Are Not Waiting hashtag was a beacon to seekers and networkers and solvers to gather together. And champions recognized the opportunity. And so now I would say that, that they're starting to get towards that upper right quadrant. Champions have gone on to sponsor prize competitions because there's actually a lot of little things and annoying things about diabetes that people want to solve. Champions at the FDA also worked with the diabetes hackers, making sure that they were staying on the right side of the law without getting in the way of their progress. And I'm happy to say that the open source code that underlies the open APS, the open artificial pancreas system, has received FDA approval. And so now we've got this code that really started among a bunch of patient hackers, posted on GitHub, and it has FDA approval. So another a story that I like to tell, and you'll see that I like to tell both deep history examples as well as recent history examples. This is one from the 1980s. In 1987, patient-led research groups who were frustrated by the slow pace of government action on HIV and AIDS asked Anthony Fauci, who was then the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, to change federal guidelines to recommend a promising drug that early studies showed was effective against preventing a serious fungal infection, pneumocystitis pneumonia, or PCP. But Fauci looked at the data and said, no, the data is not there yet. I'm not going to change the federal guidelines. And on one of the panels, people talked about, sometimes it's the right thing to do to march on Washington. Other times the right thing to do is go back and collect more data. And so these activists went back and collected the data. They did a community-led study, and they went back. And 2 years later, the FDA approved the treatment based solely on community-based research, which was a milestone for the patient-led revolution. This, again, was the late 1980s. It's an example of seekers and solvers working together. So around the same time, ACT UP emerged as a really powerful peer-led organization. You might know their history, that each chapter organized independently, and they would create actions in their city or sometimes nationally. They demanded changes at the federal level, particularly at the FDA, which controlled access. They were networkers, raising the visibility of the issues that they faced. Dr. Fauci, who was initially hesitant, this probably was the first time in recent interviews he said that he was really hesitant about the idea that patients and caregivers and survivors could contribute to science in this way. But he came around, and he said, he was talking to his fellow scientists, when it comes to clinical trials, some patient activists are better informed than many scientists can imagine. In the 1980s, Dr. Fauci became a champion of the patient-led revolution. Now, he benefited from the work of his deputy, James Hill, who was gay and HIV positive. And James Hill acted as an ambassador between the patient-led activists and government officials. The rebels brought outsider perspectives to insider discussions and contributed to the science that would save people's lives. HIV is an example of an emerging condition that was so new in the 1980s, it hadn't been defined. Patients themselves collected and analyzed data to prove their condition's existence and to demand research funding. And we saw that recently with long COVID. It was patients themselves who were tracking their own symptoms. It was patients who named the condition of long COVID. And the Patient-Led Research Collaborative created an incredible set of scorecards where they can show organizations who want to work with patient groups what they need to do to actually be a patient-led research group. So I'll post a link on Twitter and other platforms to that scorecard. So what I want to conclude is that we can really do amazing things if we stick together, if we leverage the talents of the seekers and networkers, solvers and champions who are in our communities. I'll close with this idea that we all want to get to that upper right quadrant. People in that upper right quadrant, they have a diagnosis. They not only have one treatment, they probably have a range of treatments. You know, if you're in that upper right quadrant, it's probably more a question of access. Can you get to the hospital where the surgery is being performed? Does your insurance pay for that drug? And again, I want to thank the rare disease communities because you, again, are leading the charge and demanding access to the kinds of treatments that will save your lives or the lives of loved ones. So, if you are a seeker, keep going. I really believe the answers are out there. Whether it's going towards a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal, or whether, as Natalie Abbott said, whether you're just reaching for hope, because hope can be as valuable as a cure. If you're a networker, continue pooling resources and sharing the best of what your and community can find. If you're a solver, start building what you think should exist. If you're a champion, look for ways to open doors to rebels. Thank you, and please stay in touch. So I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. And I will just say that I very subtly put this postcard in everybody's bag, and there are some on the front tables. My book comes out in February, so it's kind of a love letter to rare disease communities and people living with life-changing diagnoses. So I hope you'll check it out. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Reckesens from the Orphan Disease Center at Penn. So we are developing a prize competition for an in-home calcium device, measuring device, similar to the original ones for diabetes, I suppose.
Cool.
So my question, and that we've been thinking about, do you think it's important for us to talk to the FDA prior to the call for proposals for projects to make sure that what we're asking for is something's going to be approved? And if so, could you point us to the right place?
Yes, yes and yes. So when I interviewed solvers in the diabetes communities, people took two different tracks. So there was one group of people who were very nervous about doing anything that would get them crossways. These are people who had worked in like the financial services area, a highly regulated area of life, and so they didn't want to do anything that the FDA didn't approve. Frankly, at first the FDA said no, you shouldn't go forward. There was another group of solvers who went ahead without telling anybody and just did it. And they asked for forgiveness instead of permission. For your case, I would actually say yes, I would talk to somebody at Cedar, and I have some names, let's get in touch, of people who can advise you. The other people that I would talk to are people who have done prize competitions within the diabetes community, and I have those names as well. Great.
Any other questions? Well, with that, Susannah, amazing. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us today. You are